Hi guys, short video on consumer and producer surplus. What are these things? Surplus means we have more of something. So it's purely an economic concept. So it's not a history concept, a surplus of food, nothing like that. So in general, consumer surplus is the buyer's willingness to pay for something, to buy something, minus the price. Producer surplus is not the producer's willingness to buy something, but the price minus the seller's willingness to sell something. Okay, so what does that mean? So a real simple example. If the price of any product is $20 and the buyer is willing to pay more than that, say 25, then his consumer surplus is 5. So his willingness minus the price gives him, he could do anything he wants with that $5. He can buy anything else. Okay, surplus. The producer is willing to sell something at 10. They can make a profit at 10, so therefore they're willing to get up, produce that product, sell it for $10, and they'll still make some type of profit on it. But they'd also be willing to sell at 10, and the price is 20, right? So the consumer surplus is 20 because they were still making a profit at 10. So what did I do? I took the price minus the seller's willingness, and I get 20 minus 10 gives you 10. The total surplus is just the addition of the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus. So the total surplus would be 15. Okay? So what does that look like on a graph? Well, here's an example. So what I like to tell students is they got to imagine that there's people all over. If this was a market for whatever this product is, there's people on this demand curve, and they have different willingnesses to buy something, right, as consumers. There's people on this side of the demand curve, and they have lower willingnesses to buy. So the people over here, they're only willing to buy under $5. Are they going to get the product? No, they're not going to buy the product because it's not the price they're willing to pay. The sellers, these are sellers who are willing to produce at lower prices because they still make profit. They call them low-cost sellers. These are high-cost sellers. These sellers are only willing to sell when the price is above $5. It's not worth it for them to sell unless the price is 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10. So these people, the market really only exists over here because everybody else is buying and selling different things in the world. So really we're only talking about this half of the market, this guy, this little triangle. That's our producer and consumer surplus. The area above on the demand curve. So the demand curve is this triangle up here. This is our consumer surplus, CS. If I had different chalk, I would show you down here. This is our supply curve. So over here, this triangle is our producer surplus. When you add them together, the whole triangle is the total surplus. Pretty simple. That's what it looks like visually. Same example we did before, different numbers, but that's what it would look like here. So in this example, I want you to figure out what the consumer surplus is, what the producer surplus is, and what the total surplus is. How do you do that, Mr. Ryan? Well, you just take the area of the triangle. Super easy. Pause it, figure it out. Good, the pause is over. So I'm going to take 1/2 the base times the height to find the consumer surplus. The consumer surplus is here. So 10 goes to 5, and then the quantity goes from 0 to 10. So we could take this whole, we got 5, and then half of 10, 1/2 the base. So 5 and 5, so we've got 25. Right? So 5 times 1/2 of this is 25. The producer surplus we got between 5 and 1, so this is 4. So 4 times half of 10 is 5. 4 times 5 gives you 20. And now all I have to do is add up 25 and 20, and I get 45. I could have taken the entire triangle to find the total surplus, but why do that? Because I've already got these two. And that's how you get producer and consumer surplus. Is it that important in macroeconomics? It's not that important. You're probably not going to get any questions about it. However, I am going to refer to it, so I want you to know what the concept is. All right, the next thing for macro for this topic on consumer and producer surplus is what happens when the government taxes an economy for any product whatsoever. This is not saying that taxes are good or taxes are bad. We're just saying what happens to consumer and producer surplus when there's a tax on society. I'm going to show you what happens if they tax a seller. Okay? An excise tax means, as opposed to a lump sum tax, means that you're getting taxed on every new good produced. So let's say the government taxes suppliers $2, $2 tax, okay? Well, you know from your shifters of supply, when the government taxes a product, what happens to supply? It shifts to the left, right? It costs more for each product to be produced. So the shaded in area is my total surplus. What happens to total surplus? Well, supply is going to shift to the left by $2. They're not going to look exact, but let's say I shift to the left by $2. Here's my S1, there's my S2, there's my arrow. What happens now? My equilibrium was here. I was producing 10 at $5. Now I'm producing, let's say 6. Okay? Well, if you look closely, what happened? The price of the product has gone up to maybe $7 about, and there's this little triangle that's been created right here. Okay? Now that little triangle is what's known as dead weight loss. So because of the tax, okay, this company could have been producing 10. Because of the tax, now they have to produce at 6, and they could be producing this extra surplus. And if I wanted to find out what the dead weight loss was, I could find out the area of that little triangle. So if this was, what did we say? This was 7, we said, and you would take the bottom of the triangle, maybe it goes down to 3. I would take that number, and my other measurement would be 0 to 6, and I can find 1/2 the base times the height. I'm not going to do it because you usually don't have to do that in macro. In micro you would, but that's the concept. Question is, what happens to surplus when there's an excise tax? Loss in surplus. That's the answer. Okay? Now, the next 2 questions you might have to know that have to do with consumer and producer surplus is what happens if there is a subsidy done by the government, not a tax, and what happens if there's an import quota. So let me go over this one again. What's a subsidy? It means the government is giving a company money to produce something. So what happens to the supply curve, not when they're taxed, but when the government does the opposite, when they give you money? Well, then the supply curve increases. So our new equilibrium is over here. Now we're producing not 10 like we were before, but maybe 15, 20, who knows? But take a look. If this is my new price, so price goes down, then more people are buying, more people are clearly selling more. So now what happens to my triangle? Well, in this case, it actually gets bigger. So what happens to surplus? It grows during a subsidy, opposite of a tax. What about an import quota? An import quota, probably not on your exam, but just in case it is, an import quota simply means the country is only allowing you to take a certain number of imports. It's reducing the amount of free trade between, say, the US and China. So an import quota is very similar to a trade restriction. It is. It's a trade restriction, very similar to a tariff. But an import quota, usually, we get more stuff when we trade, right? You've done the PPF. You know that trade benefits both societies. So if the government is keeping us from getting goods from another country, what do you think happens to our consumer surplus? Can we buy more stuff for cheap or less stuff for cheap? The answer is we can buy less stuff if they do an import quota. So a subsidy, we gain surplus, total surplus. In an import quota, we lose surplus. Okay? Just memorize it. It might pop up on an exam somewhere. Okay, the last part of this has to do with something called price controls. You should take notes on this. So a government price control, sometimes a lot of economics textbooks say, interferes with the free market. And I'll get to what that means in a second. So a price control, there's either a price floor or a price ceiling. Okay, pretty simple. An example of a price floor is minimum wage, which means that what do? Firms must pay all labor a minimum amount. They cannot go below. It makes a law, right? They cannot pay below the minimum. Okay. They can pay above the minimum, no problem. They can't pay below the minimum. On the other hot side, a price ceiling means that an example is rent control. A landlord must not raise rent above a certain amount. They can go below a certain amount. Again, no problem. That's called non-binding. It's a non-binding ceiling. Doesn't interfere with the free market. A non-binding minimum wage doesn't interfere with the free market. So for example, for this one, if New York paid $15 minimum wage and Idaho had a law where they only paid 14, they have different laws, right? So therefore one could be binding in one state. But if companies were paying $20, then this law would be in effect, but it wouldn't be effective, right? Similarly here, if rent was $1,000, the maximum rent could go, rent control would be $1,000, and landlords were only charging $800. That would be an ineffective rent control. It only becomes a problem when the landlord wants to pay more. It only becomes a problem when the firm wants to pay people less. So let's see what they look like. On a graph, we have two separate graphs here. I'm going to start with the ceiling. It's easier to understand. So the ceiling states you've got rent control. There's rent, and there's the number of apartments. Let's say one-bedroom apartments in New York, something like that. And we have 100 in this particular complex. Well, the rent control says the free market, right, says that the landlord has a QS equals the QD at $1,200 a month. So then the government steps in and says, you know what, people have been petitioning, rent is too high. What could we do about this? Well, let's make rent control. What would you make it? Would you make it more or would you make it less? To make what's called an effective or binding rent control, you would have to put it under, right? An effective ceiling is below the market price. The market price is where the X is, right? Where supply meets demand, QS equals QD. So you would make it somewhere below. So you draw a straight line and you put ceiling. And we'll make our ceiling $1,000 rent instead of $1,200. Well, what about the minimum wage? How do we make an effective minimum wage? Well, right now, this is wages and this is labor. This is not a product, this is a people. So the supply is not the supply of the product, but the supply of the laborers, the number of people willing to sell their labor. These are demand for labor. So it's a bit of a different graph. This is called a resource graph, whereas this is more of a product graph, okay? So wages in this particular scenario are $10 per hour. Is that the minimum wage or is that the free market wage? That's the free market wage. This is where the QS, remember that? The QS equals the QD. That's where the market is most efficient. This point and this point. We're getting the most we can from our scarce resources at those points. If you wanted to make an effective minimum wage, how much would you make minimum wage? Well, what's the point of minimum wage? The point of minimum wage is to raise prices, raise the value, right? Have larger incomes for people who are poorer. So you'd want to have it above. If you made it $8, it wouldn't really have an effect. Companies are already paying $10. So an effective wage is above the market price. This is going to be my MW, my minimum wage. This right here shows you an effective minimum wage and an effective floor and an effective ceiling. So what does that mean? What's the big deal? Well, what do these things do? What's the problems that occur? It's good for some people. The people who are getting a high, let's say it's $12 an hour. The people who are getting $12 an hour are happier. The people who are paying $1,000 a month are happier rather than $1,200. Well, what's the problem in the market? The problem is we are no longer at equilibrium. The QD is no longer going to equal the QS. So what are our new QD and QS? Over here, this is our demand. So therefore, our QD is over here, and our QS is over here. What do we have? When you have QD less than QS, you have a surplus. But in this case, a surplus of what? Labor. So less people are working. They argue that unemployment actually increases. But we're not going to talk about that in this class. Over here, what happens? Well, the same thing. You have, instead of the, but not the Q, now you have the QS, which is less than the QD. So all of a sudden, people are like, hey, I want an apartment for $1,000. So more people want the apartment, but less landlords are like, you know what? I'll just give it to my nephew, and I'll let him live here for free. It's better for me. So here you have not a surplus, but you have a shortage of apartments. And so the argument is, in most economics textbooks, is that minimum wage, price floors, rent control, price ceilings, they create an inefficiency in the market, and they create surpluses and shortages. All right, I have a packet on this. Try to do the questions. I hope you understand that.